Good morning, guys, and thank you for joining us at this fairly early hour. It's the first time we've done one of these early in the morning or in the morning. We're normally a little late in the day, so hopefully you've been able to join us. Welcome to the Horses for Change Leadership Development webinar, which is going to focus quite a lot on how and challenge how we can use horses in a very innovative way to develop what we believe is a key part of leadership, which is the emotional intelligence of individuals, but also of the organization. So I'm here with Casey McDoodle, who's one of our leadership coaches and directors of Horses for Change. And just to introduce my own self, a few of you I think already know me, but my name is Dave Manning. I'm the managing director of Horses for Change, and also of a company called Dave Manning Integration Limited, who are basically a supply chain company who focus on supply chain development and indeed change management. Well, of course, as we all know, change management of whatever type of change it is highly dependent upon leadership. Hence the two organizations, Horses for Change and DMI, Dave Manning Integration, work very much hand in hand to make lasting and permanent change in organizations, whether they be from my background, supply chain organizations and manufacturing organizations, or whether they be from a service-based industry such as the police force or the NHS, etc. Basically, leadership is at the heart of all change. So I'm here with Casey McDoodle, as I said. So Casey, your own role in this?
Hi, morning everyone. Yes, so I am, as David said, a director and coach for Horses for Change. And a little bit of my experience, just to give you an idea, is very much horses have been very much part of my life. And I know from working with them personally how they've helped me with leadership skills and being very, becoming more aware of my own myself really, and what makes me tick. And I've always thought that there's more to the horses than the riding aspect. So it's been a great sort of always great to collaborate really when it comes to working with people in the workplace, and how the horses, even though it's strange as it may sound, the horses can help us become better leaders, become more self-aware, and most importantly, become very aware of our emotional intelligence and how that can help us in situations both in our day-to-day life but also in the workplace.
That's great. Thank you very much, Casey. So if we start off by looking at a comparison really between management and leadership. You know, people often refer to these things as the same issue, whereas in fact we see them quite differently. John Anderson at the bottom here was known as the Burger King turnaround man. He turned Burger King into a successful organization when they had been struggling previously. And then, as you can see here, he went on to be the CEO of Citicorp. And some of the comments he makes here are, management gives you a position, not leadership. You don't need a position to be a leader. And oftentimes we think that once we become a certain level of manager, we have become a leader. That is not true. Management simply gives us the position in the organization. Leadership is how we lead the organization. Very different. What John also said here is, and forgive his slightly non-political correct term here, but people hate a boss. What we really want is a leader. So his words were, a boss spelled backwards is double son of a bitch. So people want leadership. And we seek that. We do not want to be told what to do. We do not want to be managed. We want to be led. And there's a big difference here. So leaders are not moody. They are very consistent. You know, you often hear people say, oh, I wonder what mood the boss is in today. Or did he have a bad night? Or did he get up on the right side of the bed? Or did they do this? I wonder how we're going to find them today. That is not leadership. Leadership is very consistent. We trust it, we know it, we understand it, we can rely on it. Those are all highly important traits of that leadership. Leaders rather, are very much a lighthouse. They point in the destination. They highlight the destination we're going to. You'll hear me talk a little later in this about vision. Those two things are pretty similar. So where are we headed? Not a weather vane in terms of go in this direction. It's not about going in this direction. It's about taking us to that point in the future, which is the lighthouse analogy here. And certainly leaders are not arrogant. They don't play the power game. They don't play the politics. People trust them. They trust them because they believe that the leader has their best interest at heart. And I'll refer back to that a little bit later. So those are some of the thoughts that John had. But Casey, in your experience in working with horses, do you think that they encourage you, horses encourage you to focus on any of these sort of traits?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when it comes to working with the horses, every one of those traits that you spoke about, Dave, come up. So looking at the video here, consistency, trust, respect, all these things are coming in. I'm asking this horse to work with me. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm not, being the boss. I'm being the leader and showing that they can trust and respect me to do that. And with each individual, although I have to be consistent with my leadership style, I also have to be self-reflective and see that perhaps I might need to change that slightly to suit each different character. Each horse has different characteristics, just like humans. And it's for me as the leader and us when we're working with them in our courses to see that we need to be flexible and very self-reflective in that moment when we're working with the different horses.
That's really interesting, and I've seen you work in this way many times with the horses during our workshops and team building sessions, and the similarities of what's required as a good leader and what's required in a human perspective and what's required as a good horse leader, as you are demonstrating here, is remarkable. It's very interesting. From a business perspective, John Anderson goes on to say, leaders are the first to apologize. In other words, it's not my fault. I love the story that goes back many years to Brian Clough, the famous football manager. Now, I don't know whether he said this for motivational purposes or whether he was being a leader in the first to apologize sense, but Brian Clough was famed for having big rants at half time if things had not gone well. And apparently, I think it was Nottingham Forest. They went out on the pitch and they were losing 2-0 at the time at half time. And as they walked back in, they were expecting the traditional Brian Clough rant. And apparently, they sat in the changing rooms all half time, and Brian never showed up until about 30 seconds before they were due to go out, when he popped his head around the door and said, "Don't worry about the first half, lads. I chose the wrong team." Now, whether that was a veiled threat, in other words, you won't be playing next week or not, he was the first to say, "I'm the leader of this. I'm taking responsibility," and responsibility is a key part of leadership. Leaders set extraordinary versus ordinary goals. We don't want to be just a little bit better. We want to be the best. We want to be the top. We want to succeed. We want to set ourselves extraordinary goals. Now, they may not be financial goals. They are just extraordinary goals to challenge ourselves. Managers make excuses. In other words, there is a very common phraseology in organizations and business that I've worked with over the years, which is called victimization. Victimization is where if we set a target for something, maybe it's 100 manufacturers, 100 sales, 100 customers, 100 something. If we achieve 100, excuse me, if we achieve 100, then clearly that is success. However, if we achieve 80, however, we have a whole bunch of really good reasons why we only achieved 80, and none of those reasons were my fault, then that is also success. Well, a manager may think that way, a leader does not. 100 is success and 80 is not success. My favorite one of those victimization stories goes back to the British Rail days, when British Rail set a target of on-time arrival of trains of plus or minus 20 minutes. So if it's 19 minutes late, it's on time, which doesn't really make much sense to me, but nevertheless, that was the definition. And then, of course, we know that they had a whole bunch of reasons why, if they were late, it wasn't their fault. leaves on the track, snow on the track, wrong type of snow on the track. And then, of course, in summer, the rails would buckle. So the British Rail had a reason why their service was bad for the whole year, none of which were their fault. Of course, they can't control the leaves, they can't control the snow, etc. That is the response of a leader, of a manager, I'm sorry, not of a leader. And you will see that victimization behavior in many organizations. Leaders seize the moment. Casey will talk about horses living in the moment. Leaders seize the moment and recognize the magnitude of that opportunity. They're bold, they're brave, they make decisions. They listen, but they make decisions, as the bottom point says. Leaders listen to everybody, take that all on board, but then leaders take that bold decision. They don't always seek consensus because, frankly, we can't always get consensus. So those were some of the thoughts of John Addison. But Casey, I guess you see similarities with working with horses to many of these things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, pretty much to the majority of what you've said. And quite right, so like horses do, they live in the moment. And I think that is one of the essential things that they really encourage us to do when we're working with them in our courses as individuals or teams. And from an emotional intelligence point of view, it's not just about, getting in deep into about, what you're feeling and your emotion, not at all. It's merely about learning what makes you tick, because in all our behind every behavior that we have or our thinking, there will be some emotion driving that forward. And it's how sometimes those emotions can help us in a negative way to therefore get a reaction from somebody rather than an appropriate response. A reaction and response to very different things. And the horses are great at helping us to, in that moment, be self-reflective and process what our actions truly said to them. So once we know more about emotional intelligence in general, so our communication, our social skills, all these sorts of things, it allows us to then use that information to guide our thinking and therefore our behaviors, not only of ourselves in certain situations, but also of our colleagues, our employees, and setting them up for success in whatever situation they may be in. And just touching on the listening side, I'll go into this more later, but as a leader working with the horses, you do have to listen, and you do then process and try to understand, why did the horse just respond to me like that? Was it me and what I was truly saying with my body, or was it just what I thought I was saying with my voice? All these things really encourage us to be very self-reflective in that moment, and therefore we learn more about ourselves. And once we know how we tick, we can then go on to learn more about others and how we can influence them and their behaviours.
Yeah, that's a good relate back. And leadership, of course, in business is all about people. We, both Casey and myself, love to work with horses, but actually, of course, we're using that for our pleasure, but also from our business perspective. But of course, when we turn that into the external business, then it is all about people and how people respond. So what we believe here is that, as we've sort of already hinted at quite a few times already today, people respond to leadership. They respond to leadership because they want to be led. Casey will explain about horses a little later, but horses look for leadership. And they look for leadership to be able to be protected. They want leaders who have their back, as we say. So a very key part of the way people respond, and therefore how business changes and how business succeeds, is based upon how leadership is existent in that business. However, we also respond to targets, in other words, key performance indicators. It is not a new phrase to hear me say. People will respond, people behave in the way they are measured. So if I measure you irrationally, then how will you behave? Well, the answer to that, of course, is irrationally. In fact, somebody once said to me, if you measure me irrationally, behaving irrationally is very rational. And of course, that's a very true statement. So what do we mean by irrationally? Well, it's either defensively or in the interest of my own area, so silo mentality. So the KPIs will drive us. One of the things that we want to think about there when setting up KPIs is don't ask which KPI we should have. Ask what behavior we want. So if we can define the behavior we would like from people, then figure out the measure that will create that behavior. If you do it the other way around and create the measure first, you will get the behavior you deserve, not the behavior that you desire. That is very much the same as when we talk to our children. You know, I remember my own daughter, my youngest daughter. I used to say to her, Sophie, you need to be back in when she started to go out in the evening, you need to be back at home by 10:30. Now, of course, if she didn't come in at 10:30, there had to be some consequences. Now, consequences does not mean beating. Consequences mean consequences. It helps to build our accountability and our responsibility. Now, the measure part of that, if Sophie came in at 11:30, how would I know? Well, of course, I had a tool, which was a measure, which was called a clock, and I monitored the clock. Now, there's a very simple example, but the clock in that sense is my measure, and therefore there had to be some consequences of if she came in at 11:30. If she came in at 11:30 and there were no consequences, we can all guess what time she would come in the following night, which would be 12:30. So KPIs are a very key part of all of this. Also, the vision. People want leadership, but they want leadership towards something of significance. That's why we said, John Addison said, leaders focus upon the lighthouse and not the weather vane. So vision, as I'll come on to in a few moments, a very, very key driver. So Casey, we say here that people respond to leadership behavior. How does that translate to the leadership development that you and myself and the colleagues at Horses for Change run in our workshops?
Well, it's very relatable in the sense that, and again, having a look at this video, short clip, horses through experiential learning, the horses become great metaphors for scenarios and situations that we may experience in day-to-day life or at work. And as you can see here in the video, here's a team, they're not touching the horse. In this sense, the horse was a fellow colleague, and they're having to work together and show leadership styles and skills to encourage this horse to come along with them. He has a choice. He doesn't necessarily have to follow them if he wants. There's no lead rope, head collar, or anything like that. That colleague has a choice to follow them if he feels that he can trust their leadership, respect them, feel safe within that team and their leadership, and feels that they're all being consistent with their clear communication that's coming across to him to help him feel all those various things we just touched on. And I think from a team building point of view, this is a great example to see where it can be successful and they can get a great feeling from the fact that, hey, look, we've got this great big animal coming along with us on his own decision. And it's only through how they are executing themselves from a body language point of view and as a leader that he's coming along with them. So in this sense, through non-verbal communication and clear communication, the horses help us basically with those, because we're having to really draw deep through how we can show through our body language what we're trying to say without verbally saying it. And I think this is something really key that is highlighted in exercises with the horses.
Yeah, I've seen many of the things that Casey has just explained many times in our workshops. But Casey, apart from the fact that we both happen to love horses, why are horses so good to use in this role? Why couldn't we use something else? I can't think of something else, but something else. So why horses?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because we do get asked why horses. At the end of the day, a lot of people are thinking, well, I haven't got any horses in my workplace. How on earth is a horse going to help me with my, my employees? I mean, come on. So horses, as we know, are herd animals, and they are sentient beings. So they do pick up on emotions. They too have their own emotions, and they're very, very intuitive beings. So because they are herd animals and they're prey animals, they're very in touch with their instincts. And therefore, and like I said before, their body language is key to their form of communication. You know, yes, they whinny and they neigh, but predominantly they communicate. 97% really is through body language. The rest of it is non-verbal, whereas it's the opposite for humans. We're predominantly verbal. So working with the horses, we have to really tune in with what we're saying with our body, and also things such as when we're in the workplace, you know, we have an agenda, we have tasks, we have all those targets we've got to meet, and horses don't. They don't have an agenda. They don't have the ability to. They live very much in the moment, as I said before. And egos, that's something that us as humans, whether we like to admit it or not, we do have egos. And again, horses don't. They very much are in the moment with their herd. And yes, they have hierarchy and they're respectful of each other within that hierarchy. But each horse is has that mutual respect, trust within that herd, and all these things are things that we can replicate and learn more about, because they all transfer into our workplace with our colleagues, employees, managers, everything. So this is why they're perfect for this sort of work.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've spent many years studying leadership and trying to understand myself, to be honest. And that was the motivation to begin with, but I've translated it very much into my work life. I've studied the writings of many authors, Joel Barker, The Power of Vision, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, David Marquardt, Turn the Ship Around. These are some of the ones that have influenced me the most. However, those and others all point to the same thing. They point to vision being a critical forerunner to success, and that's the key, forerunner. We need to set a vision of that lighthouse again, back to the first slide of John Anderson's, of where we're going. What is our vision? What do we want to become? And not become in terms of visions, in our view, should not be, I want to earn £1 billion. I want to have set financial targets as my vision. Our view is that vision or financial targets or financial results are always achieved through a vision being achieved as compared to a vision for themselves. So what is our vision, and the consequences of that will be a success. So vision, in our view, is very, very powerful as a driver, and we would encourage both ourselves individually, our teams and our company to focus on that vision. What do we want to become? It needs to be stretching, it needs to be challenging, it needs to be something of significance. Indeed, in the book Man's Search for Meaning that Viktor Frankl wrote, one of his phrases was, it is a quintessential trait of man that man cannot live without having a vision of something significant to do in his future. Now, that book is a very powerful book, and maybe some of you read it, but nevertheless, it reinforces this point. The vision provides the criteria to validate our decision-making and our actions. Hence, the decision-making and actions, or the vision rather, needs to be couched in a phrase of what do we want to become, what is our belief as compared to how much money do we want to make. Talking about decisions and actions, there's another reason that I believe that horses are so powerful in this work, and that is because all decision-making in the human body is driven from a part of the brain known as the limbic system. The limbic system is where our feelings, our beliefs, our values live, and it is that part of the brain that drives our decision-making. It's what Simon Sinek and myself over the years have referred to as the why. Why is that important? Why do we want to do that? What is our belief? Hence driving those decision makings. Now, horses, as Casey was explaining earlier, are very limbic. So when we work with horses, we're actually working with that limbic system. The limbic system, the limbic part of the brain, has no capacity for language. It only has capacity for feeling and emotion, etc. Hence, if we have a powerful driver in the vision, it will drive that decision and action. In other words, what do we want to become? You know, a little bit like you say to your kids, isn't it? It's a very powerful thing for children. You know, when we ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, this is the same thing. It's a high-level statement. However, it has some meaning. It needs to be documented with sufficient characteristics for us to understand what that means to me, to us, to my team, as compared to the vision statements that you see in many organizations, which is more the high-level statement, which is basically the vision on the wall of reception that says, I want to be wonderful. I've read thousands of them in my life, and they all say the same thing. We want to be wonderful. Well, that's great, but who would say, I want to be lousy? What does it mean? And unfortunately, very few organizations go on to say, well, what are the characteristics of that? And that's what we refer to as the extended vision here. It also helps us in deciding what capabilities, skills. Now here, skills, we embrace emotional intelligence with that. So what sort of behaviors, when we say skills, it's not skills in a functional sense. It does include that, of course, but it's skills in terms of the behavior of the organization, the emotional intelligence of the organization, and therefore the emotional intelligence of the individuals within that organization. What do we need to do to acquire those skills, capabilities, and behavior? Perhaps environment is perhaps a better word there. How do we develop that? And if we have a vision that really drives us in that direction, it's a very powerful tool. Of course, this isn't particularly new stuff. Back to the famous Peter Drucker and one of his classic illustrations where he was asking three stonecutters, why are you cutting stones? The first one says, because I need the money. Don't we see that very often? You know, why do you work here? 9 to 5, pays the mortgage, etc. The second one, slightly better, because I'm pretty good at it. Yes, that's fine. I'm pretty good at it, but is it contributing to the vision that we've just set previously, or is it just because you're good at doing this? We should not be doing things we can do. We should be doing things that drive towards our vision. And the third one, of course, says, because I'm building a cathedral. Well, clearly, the person building the cathedral had an awful lot more vision, motivation, emotion than the first two. And this, very old illustration, but this one I really relate to and resonate with quite significantly. So, what elements would you expect to see in this vision? Well, first of all, it needs to be leadership inspired. So the leadership of our organization need to decide the style, the behavior, why we exist, what are our beliefs, what are our values, why are we in business? And again, to remind ourselves, that's not to make a profit. That is always the result of this. It needs to be concise but shared and supported. So the conciseness, you could say, well, that's the message on the reception wall. That's very concise. I'd like to be wonderful. In fact, I see many of them. I'd like to be wonderful. And these words are always in them, aren't they? You know, people, continuous improvement, environment, trust, honesty, etc. Success, world, class. Well, those are all great words. In fact, I'm convinced somebody with a random word generator has made a fortune, because those words are in all of them. How do people get involved with that? How do they become, how do they share that, and how do they support that? Well, that's where the extended vision comes. That's where the characteristics come. Has to be positive. Has to be significantly positive, not just a little bit better. We'd like to be, I often struggle when people say, we'd like to be number 3 in the world. Who would ever like to be number 3? You know, why don't we want to be, why can't we vision being number 1? It's got to be positive, it's got to be engaging, it's got to be challenging, it's got to be significant. And finally, it's got to be measurable. Of course, the most famous vision was the Kennedy statement, a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which of course we've all heard before. Actually, that wasn't Kennedy's vision statement. What he said was man on the moon and back again by the end of the decade. Now, of course, if you're the man that's going, the second bit's quite important, isn't it? But of course, it was measurable. Did we get a man on the moon? Well, allegedly we did. Did he come back? Well, yes, he did. Was it by the end of the decade? Yes, it was. And so, while that is a pretty high-level one, it was pretty concise, it engaged with people. But I'll bet you that there were other extended visions within NASA that said, okay, in order to do that, we have to have a vision of this. We have to have these characteristics. We have to have these things. We have to have these behaviors. We have to have these capabilities. We have to have this emotional intelligence. We have to engage people in this way. Because without that, I think basically Kennedy's vision would have been just simply words and dreaming and probably rhetoric against the Russians. So the elements of that vision sort of summarized on the page here. What we're saying here is that what managers really believe, and I say managers, not just leaders here, so deliberately, and so what managers really believe about people and how they treat them will largely determine how well we do. You hear many organizations, and I've heard many organizations say, people are our most important asset. And then, of course, when you step back and observe the way those people are treated in that business, then it's more like stuff you pick up on your shoe. So we're perfectly good at making the words. People are our most important asset. Yes, absolutely. And I completely agree with that statement. In fact, if you take out the people from your organization, what is left? Now, and the answer to what is left is nothing. Not something, nothing. Because if you take out the people of your organization, then you're left with a building, an empty building. Well, eventually that building will decay and fall over. You may be left with some product. Well, of course, if you do nothing with that product, it will eventually rot and disappear, and certainly go obsolete. So actually, when we say people are our most important asset, actually people are our only asset. Because if you take them away, then we're left with nothing. And this talks back, what managers really believe about people, talks back to some of the comments that Casey made about communication. And quite interestingly, but factually, only 7% of communication is verbal. Let me just say that again. Only 7% of communication is verbal. Now, you don't really have to be a mathematician to figure out, therefore, that 93% of communication is non-verbal. And that's one of the reasons that we choose to use horses. Casey explained a lot about the reasons there, but of course horses can't speak. Of course they can't speak English. They can speak actually, but they don't speak English. So if we're going to work with horses and communicate with horses, then it can't be verbal because they don't speak English. Or either that or they speak every language in the world, because people work with horses all over the world. So in the workplace, we communicate all day long. How we listen is a communication. What we say and how we say it is a communication. In fact, what we don't say is probably often a bigger communication. What we do and what we don't do, again, communication. Words are not the issue. It is an old phrase, is it not, that actions speak louder than words? Well, that's very, very true. Actions is our behavior. When and how often we do the above? Is it just that we say this is what we want to do, this is what we want to be on the big once-a-year jamboree, or is it how we live? Is it how we live every day? Is it what we believe in? Is it what we really demonstrate our beliefs? So people talk about leadership support for change programs, for example. That, of course, is important. We want leadership support, but actually, really, what we want is leadership commitment. And commitment is all about action. It's not about words. Of course, the very old but famous phrase about the traditional English breakfast. In the traditional English breakfast, the hen was very supportive, but the pig was highly committed. And we need commitment in our leadership. So where are we communicating? We're communicating all the time. The throwaway lines we say at the coffee machine, in meetings, our body posture in meetings, the little snippets of telephone that we hear, on the video at lunch, the dreaded email. Yeah, email, a very lousy way of communication. On the plane, we overhear things all of the time is where we're communicating. So Katie, I've sort of tied in with horses again a little bit there, but how can horses help us to develop our non-verbal communication as part of our leadership skills?
Yeah, so I think just picking up from where you left off there, David, as you know, quite rightly so, 7% is verbal and the rest non-verbal. And as I mentioned before, horses predominantly speak through body language. And I think what was really key there was the fact that, us as humans, we're very good at talking the talk, and saying things and promise this and I'll go do that, and saying a lot verbally. It's very easy to say stuff, but most of the time what we're truly saying, and in comparison to what our body's saying and what we're projecting outwardly with our body language, is usually very different. And I think that brings us down to being very congruent. Congruency is a huge thing that I think a lot of people don't necessarily give a huge amount of credit to. What we're truly saying versus what our body's saying, if those two things are not the same, we're therefore not being congruent. And I think this then ties back to our beliefs, our values, and all those sorts of things that have a huge influence on whether we feel. Do we feel that we can actually say what we're truly feeling, or do we think that we're going to be judged, or we're going to be, told off, or are we going to be given a warning? All these different things are influences that drive our behaviors. And I think going back to the emotional intelligence, yes, horses are extremely good at helping us to learn to communicate and learn to be more congruent, because within that moment that we're doing something with the horses, if we say something to them and actually they're picking up on our body language saying the opposite, they're not going to react how we perhaps think that they're going to. What they're going to do is respond how they see fit and appropriately. And it's for us then in that moment to reflect on that and look at ourselves, look at what we thought we said versus what we actually said, and how we can then change that and have another go. And I think that's the beauty of it. Horses are very forgiving, and they do allow you to have that another go, whereas perhaps in the workplace you don't necessarily always get that. So the more you are able to practice this with the horses and experience through the experiential learning, you can then have you're setting yourself up for success in another way of saying it, through having a go and therefore responding differently in your workplace.
That's really interesting. We're going to come back a little bit later to talk about a blameless society, but clearly Casey has just sort of introduced that as part of this conversation, that there's no blame culture. But of course, the other side of communication, and the other side of at least the verbal communication, is listening. And it's not only the verbal communication. But interestingly, there are types of listening. There's what we refer to here as automatic listening. This is what we do most of the day and most of the time. Problem with automatic listening is it leaves us with no choices and no possibilities, because what really happens is the speaker speaks and the listener has a bunch of filters that they are applying to what they're hearing, or indeed, as Casey referred to earlier, seeing. And what those filters are doing are making judgments. Do I agree? Do I disagree? Is this right or is it wrong? Do I believe in it or do I not? Has this fit? Do I believe? Does it make sense? Or does it not make sense to me? How should I respond? And there's another part of that filter which, again, Casey introduced a little bit before when she talked about a little voice in the head. Many years ago, I wrote some articles that referred to my name for that, which is the automatic way of being. Every one of us has an automatic way of being. which are little basically switches and electronic nodes in our brain that have been turned to be able to respond in a particular way. Very often, that automatic way of being has been influenced and indeed set by things that have happened throughout our life, in particular happened in childhood. And what that means is that there are a little voice in our head, which is what Casey referred to, which is saying that we're not in the moment, we're filtering. In other words, right now, you guys and the people in the room with me here are listening to what I'm saying. But actually, I'll bet you a number of us are thinking, what are we going to do after this webinar? I wonder how that thing's going on that I'm working on. I wonder what's going on in that office. I wonder what's happening at home. Are the kids okay? Did the kids get to school? I wonder what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. There are more than one voice in your head right now. Now, to be truly listening to the speaker, and of course that happens to be me right now, then we need to be turning off all of those other voices. Now, you practice doing that. It is incredibly difficult. Nevertheless, practice makes perfect, and the more we can practice and be in the moment, again, relate back to something Casey talked about with the horses, if we can be in the moment and turn off those little voices, we will be more open to listening to what those things are. So we don't want the filters. What we really like to move to, which will allow possibilities, will allow us to make choices, is what we call generous listening. Generous listening is where we don't have those filters. We bypass the filters. And what we listen for, on the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, what we listen for is what is being said. What would that make possible? What is the speaker's commitment to this? Do you believe right now that I believe in what I'm saying? What would this be created? If we could do this, what would that mean for us? So the creativity piece. And be very generous. Listen in a way that is genuinely listening without the little voices. I studied some of this work a number of years ago, and I was doing it as part of a team. And the coach that was helping us through this gave us some homework. So if you're willing to take on this challenge, good luck. The homework was, they said, we were in a hotel and we were with our partners. Excuse me. And the homework was to go back to the room that night and turn off the little voice in your head and listen to your partner. We all went away and practiced and tried. We came back the next day, and one of my colleagues said, when asked, did you do your homework? Yes, I did my homework, but I had a real problem. This colleague's wife happened to be called Brenda, and said, why? He says, well, I was practicing turning off the little voice in my head, and he said, Brenda accused me of having an affair. He said, no, why is that? She said, well, you're listening to me, and you never listen to me. So sometimes it comes with consequences, but nevertheless, it is a tough thing to do. The other generous piece here is something that we try to adopt, which is assume innocence. So in a meeting situation, I'll bet we've all seen this, where somebody asks a question, but they know the answer. And the reason they're making that question or asking that question is to make a point, oftentimes a point in front of the boss. So if Casey and I were working in a project and I knew that Casey's part of the project was not going well, I might say at the meeting, Casey, how's your part of the project going? Knowing the answer is rubbish. But really what I'm doing is I'm trying to put her on the spot. I'm trying to make my point. I'm trying to make myself look good. Assume innocence is where if somebody asks a question, assume they are asking for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to truly understand. So I've sort of used Casey in that little role play there, but Casey, can horses help us with our listening skills, as well as the communication that you've already talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idle chatter is a huge topic really when it comes to working with the horses, because like I said before, the horses, they live in the moment. So they don't have that opportunity to future pace or live in the past. Whereas as humans, we're constantly doing that. We're very rarely actually living in the moment. And that voice is constantly talking away in the background. And if we go into working with the horses with that idle chatter still in our head, it will become very apparent very quickly with the way that the horses respond to us that we are not there in that moment with them. And that response could easily be something like the horse walking away and not wanting to engage at all. And how many times have we had that with employees or clients or managers, where you can tell that you're talking to them, but actually they've got this sort of look across their face where they're really not engaging with what you're saying. So I think this is something really important that they teach us to live and respond to very much only in the now. They can't predict, they can't assume, and they don't have the ability to have hindsight on what I should have done or what I could have done. So from a listening point of view, they really do draw us into being very mindful of what we're listening to. Are we listening with our whole body? Are we taking in absolutely every single thing that that person said? And are we giving them a blank slate and looking at that question with an open mind and not our opinions, not our judgments, and not projecting onto that? We're just truly listening to them. And I think this possibly, Dave, I don't know what you think. I see Sean here has put a question, and I think possibly it'd be good to tie in answering it now. So just to read it out for the others of you listening, Sean's asked, what examples of visceral visions have you come across, as opposed to the more typical corporate vision / mission statements? And Dave, I think if I could just start on that, and then you can have your. I think from a horse point of view, I think it's a really good question, Sean. We do plenty of businesses and companies that have come to us. Obviously, they have their, like you say, their typical corporate visions, missions, their statements, their sort of core values. And I think what becomes very apparent very quickly with the horses, from a personal level, really, even if they come from a team, as a team building, or as a couple of people from one company, it becomes very apparent that it becomes very much about that individual, their personal development and their own leadership skills, and how that can be transferred into their company. So yes, they do come with that vision or mission statement, but actually it goes sort of a layer deeper, where it becomes about that individual, their personal vision for themselves, and their personal mission statement within that company, but also for themselves. And I think from a visceral point of view and visions, I think obviously a lot of it comes down to everything we start to work on, and confidence, self-esteem, all these sorts of things do come up. And from the feelings aspect, I think that's where sometimes people think, oh gosh, how on earth can I open up? But really, once we start to learn that all these feelings, emotions, and all these sorts of things have a huge impact and influence on what drives our behaviors, and therefore our beliefs. And if we can really value those corporate visions, do we really believe in that vision that they have in that business?
Yeah. In fact, we had an example in one of our workshops where the individual was struggling with some of the behavioural stuff and the leadership stuff that we were working with, but actually the real thing he was struggling with was the vision of his company. He didn't buy into the vision of his company. But specifically, do we have any examples? I've got a couple that come to mind. These are not quoted word for word, but basically the vision of Apple is to challenge the status quo. It's not to make particular things, it is to challenge the status quo. And so their vision is not about money, their vision is about challenging the status quo. Their comment is, we believe in everything we do is to challenge the status quo. That is not a direct word for word quote, but that is what in essence it says. The other one is from a company called Betty's and Taylor. Betty's and Taylor are Betty's tea shops in York and Harrogate, and Taylor's are Taylor's Coffee and Yorkshire Tea. And their vision is couched around what they call the 6 Ps. And all of those Ps are non-financial. They are things like people, planet, process, passion, and they're all about, the majority of those 6 Ps are about feelings. Again, there's no mention of financial visions in there. It is what they believe in as a company. What do we want to become? We want to become excellent. We want to become the best we can be at those things. So I think there are a number of examples where people have taken that approach, and I believe they are very powerful drivers of success, as compared to be, I want to make £1 million, or any other sort of form of corporate, classical corporate type statement. I hope that helps, Sean. If you want to speak further, please do, but I hope that's given you at least some of our thoughts in response to your question, and thank you very much for your question, much appreciated. So some of the issues here, as we've said, measures drive behaviour, so therefore to achieve excellence we want to measure performance. However, this often conflicts with traditional measures, and so actually introducing measures that drive the behaviour we want, the hardest thing very often is to get rid of the old ones, especially get rid of the measures that are what we call informal. Informal measures are those things that exist in our organisation, they're never written down. I remember years ago working with one organisation where it was very clear that the biggest driver of behaviour was a measure which was known as be the person who turns the lights off. In other words, as long as you were in the office longer than the boss, then that was called well done. Of course, what behaviour did that drive? Well, it drove people to come in casually in the morning, read the newspaper, build up through a crescendo of work in the evening, and as soon as the boss went, they'd go. Now, changing the behaviour of that organisation was very much about accepting and realizing and then undoing that, what we call informal measure. There will be informal measures, not necessarily that one, but there will be informal measures in every part of our organization. So types of personal development that we therefore believe need to become part of a development program are education and training. That's obvious. There is a distinction between those two words. Please do not confuse them. Education focuses upon the why, something that we have talked about quite a lot during this webinar. Training focuses on the how. People's behavior changes based upon the why, not the how. Illustration of that point being, we live near Chester. In Chester there is a park. This story would apply to every city in the world. In Chester the park is called Grosvenor Park. It's a very nice place. There's gardens, grass, lawns, flower beds, etc. And on the grass you will see signs that say no ball games in the grass. What do you see people doing? Well, you see people playing football on the grass. In fact, you see kids playing football on the grass with using the goalpost, using the signs of the goalpost with their parents sat on park benches watching. Now, what is wrong with those parents? Is it because they can't read? No, those parents were trained to read many years ago. The issue is they don't know why. Now, if the sign had said no ball games on the grass because there's poisonous snakes in it, I think we'd have a different story. So please distinguish between those two objectives. Education is why, training is how. Then, of course, team building. We need to help people build that team. Teams go through the famous forming, storming, norming, and performing phases. And we need to help people through that, hence some of the work we do with Horses for Change in our team building exercise. Performance appraisals is a little bit back to measurement. Consequences, back to my Sophie daughter story. Problem solving. So a problem solving culture means continuous improvement. We need to live it. And then, of course, as Casey introduced earlier, a blameless society, easily said, difficult to achieve. Even the way we view our organization, traditionally, of course, we would see the view to the left. The boss is at the top, it's very hierarchical. Even drawing the organization upside down in the way we have on the right, where the leader is leading from behind. And Casey talked about some of that before. So in those terms, Casey, is the team like the herd? Is that what we're really saying here? And do horses ever lead from behind?
Yeah, again, I think there's some great things here that you can transfer into the workplace, because horses do. There's plenty of different leading positions within the herd. It's not always from the front. You have some particular, like the stallion, driving from behind, driving them into safety. You've got the mares at the front alongside, keeping grouping together. But also us as humans, we can take those different positions and learn how we can influence the horse and its movement and drive them forward, lead them forward. Do they follow? Where do they feel comfortable? And I think this is very, very transferable into the workplace, because what sort of a manager are you? Do you micromanage? Do you trust your employees? Do you give them that space and allow them to lead the way from front, but you're behind supporting that leading direction? And all these things, yes, they're metaphors, but they're extremely transferable into the workplace. And I think horses, even just from a observing them in the field point of view, can be extremely beneficial to look at how they influence each other, look at the different hierarchy, which horses are above which in the hierarchy, which ones are leading the way, which ones are pushing from behind, and how this is something that we can learn from, because a lot of these things are extremely subtle. And again, drawing it back into your emotional intelligence, once your emotional intelligence you're really in tune with it, you can be very subtle with how you influence people in a positive way for a benefit, whether it's for a project or whether it's for just a better working relationship.
That's great. So going back to one of my favorite authors, Joel Barker, just paraphrasing what he said here, is vision without action is just dreaming. We see that a lot, I think. Action without vision is just passing the time. However, vision with action can indeed change the world. And sort of finally, I often say a desk is a dangerous place from which to see the world. Get out there and work with people is what this is really saying. Don't sit at your desk. Certainly don't sit at your desk emailing your colleague next door. And I guess the parallel is that a stable is a dangerous place to view the team from. So get out and work with your horses, as Casey and ourselves do every day of our lives, developing that relationship and emotional intelligence with, in our case, horses, but in my other business sense, with people around us and our colleagues. So finally, thank you very much for joining us. We did have that one question from Sean. If there is any others, please fire away. If not, we're very happy for you to have joined us. Thank you very much. Yeah. And from my perspective, that's great.
Thank you. It's been, and hopefully, if nothing else, we've opened up a bit of a different avenue where possibly there might be a different way to help your employees. Thanks very much for listening, guys.
And thank you for your comment there, Michael. Very, very, very kind. Thanks, guys. Cheers.